Wow. It's always where I get goosebumps. In the evening, I like walking through these halls here at Centro Stile, and when I'm like in this room, in one of our big presentation rooms, that's a heavy moment, because that's when I realize the weight of the position, the responsibility a head of design here at Centro Stile carries. Because we're representing amazing brands, and this room needs to be filled with artwork. That's the expectation. And at the end of the day, it comes down to that position of head of design, where you have that responsibility to fill this big room with pieces of art.
When did you know you wanted to be a designer?
When I grew up in the 80s, I think there were two parts that impacted that decision. Number one, friends of my family, they were designers. They were graphic designers, but just the sound, the ring of being a designer just had something super fascinating, because at that moment, all it meant to me was be able to create something. And as a matter of fact, for a long time I didn't know if I wanted to become a graphic designer or a product designer or an automotive designer. It's actually something that evolved over time. But maybe the second point ended up influencing me the most, which was the fact that I was just absorbing every TV show that had a car in it, whether it was Magnum PI or The Fall Guy, Miami Vice. It didn't really matter what kind of car we're talking about. It didn't have to be a sports car, but just the car culture in itself. Because I grew up in farmland Germany, so you wouldn't see really special cars other than on TV. So it was those two things, the fascination for design, the craft of designing, and at the same time this car culture that I observed on TV.
I think the Italians have always had an eye for art. They're very visually self-conscious nation, very style conscious, and of course that goes right back to the Renaissance and beyond. And they had a notion of art that they wanted to put into their products. And so the stylishness of their products was there from the outset. And they sold their products, even though they were mass-produced, in the name of art, which made these very desirable objects and very fashionable as a result of that.
For me, good design is only possible if it checks all the boxes. At the end of the day, we're not designing to win design prizes. Yes, it's beautiful and we're very proud when we receive them, but at the end of the day, it's all about the customer.
I think when you have an extraordinary heritage, as Alfa Romeo does, it builds over the years certain expectations and so on. And I think the cliche, you can't be a real petrol head unless you've owned an Alfa Romeo, I think is a really interesting one, because I agree with it in some ways and I don't in others.
These are cars with beauty first and foremost. When you see an Alfa Romeo, you instantly know it's Italian. If you're in Italy, you're always brought up with this tremendous aesthetic sense, and it's kind of in the DNA of Italy. And Alfa Romeo really embodies that.
Great design never goes out of fashion, so if they keep the design purity, then they've got a real future ahead of them, because design is going to come to the fore. It's not all about the engines anymore, it'll be more about design and what it says about you. So Alfa Romeo, I'm sure, have a great future.
There was a time when designers were free to design really with a blank canvas, to come up with something really creative and avant-garde, whereas now there are so many more restrictions on the designers, it's much more challenging.
If anything, I think design has become even more important nowadays because of the constraints on the car as a whole. It is harder to differentiate your product across the spectrum from other brands. So if we look at Alfa Romeo, they want to send a very clear message. They want to create a car that goads you into driving, that gets you excited, that promotes that passion. And one of the key ways to do that is through design, and that's from the very first moment you see the car to little touches like what the door handle's like, the first impression when you sit in the car, what you touch. All of those things have become incredibly important in what is quite a tightly regulated industry. When it comes to desirability in a car, I think we have to remember that there's an adage these days that there's no such thing as a bad car. And while you could argue with that in some form, I think it's still fair to say that compared with 40 years ago, there is no such thing as a bad car. You can rely on a car to start in the morning to get you to work. It usually has air conditioning and all those things. Things aren't what they were. So what do you then do to make your product stand out? And of course, that means you have to design in that desirability, the want one factor. You have to elevate your car above all the others.
The modern car designer faces quite a lot of constraints imposed by legislation. Perhaps the foremost is crash safety. The car has to crush in a particular way. Then there's regulations around lamp design, the position of lighting, which dictates quite a lot in the, if you like, the face and the tail of the car. There's legislation around the visibility, i.e. what the driver can see out of the car and how clearly. And of increasing importance now is the legislation around reducing CO2 emissions. Now, until recently, that has had less impact on the design of a car from the point of view of the design department rather than engineering. But now that cars are electrifying and you have to accommodate a battery pack, a motor, an inverter sometimes, and quite a lot of control systems and wiring to go with it. And that has an impact on particularly how much space there might be in the interior. So you've got to be clever about how you package all of that. So a lot of constraints, although quite often constraints can produce inspiration.
The designer, they are never, even if they have fantastic talents, they are never creating a design without themselves taking some of the constraints that they have, some technical constraints. For sure, they have no limit at the start, and it's a good thing. What is important is that we keep in mind what makes the DNA of the brand, the DNA of Alfa Romeo, what is recognizable by our customers. That when you make a design and you think about the customers, you need absolutely to think if a customer sees these cars, really understand that these cars in an Alfa Romeo. And there are some elements like the bichonnet, like the trilobo, which are on the face of Alfa Romeo, which have been recognized from the design history of the brand and still now on and moving forward as something which is really unique to the Alfa Romeo. So which is one of the important points. The second thing is, of course, to match all the technical requirements. We know, even more now than ever, that we need to embrace the technical requirements to create new design, still remarkable cars, but to change the look and feel without losing the essence of what Alfa Romeo means. We can't think that the designer are coming with a drawing or something which they think is fantastic but it's unrealistic. No, they are taking themselves the constraints, and every designer in the car industry must take the constraints of the technical requirements whilst making a design which is unique for the brands. And I think more and more this is a challenge that has to be taken into consideration. I think Alfa has these unique things that has always been able to translate exactly this, to translate the technical requirements into beauty. What we call the functional beauty is really a concept for the brands, for now, for the past, and it has been proven in our history, and I can tell you also for the future vehicles.
As designers, one of our challenges is to always pay very close attention to society. Our car is such an important aspect of our everyday life, of what we see on the street. So for us it's important to create an object of beauty, to create visual value to our everyday life, and to be respectful to the environment and society. I think we are in a transformation with cars, and therefore it affects us car designers. Electrification very much affects the package. It's not just the powertrain for the customer, it affects the package. Connectivity, screens, the size, the amount. Are we at screen peak? Is this enough? Do we have to go back? So those are all questions that are part of our daily business as car designers.
The phrase "cars all look the same" is one that has been around actually for quite some time. Of course that's encouraged in a way by legislation and having to meet those targets, crash targets, emissions targets. But it really is the designer's challenge, and I think good design will always rise to the top, if you like, to differentiate your product through the use of form and motifs and what have you over the mass of other products.
Alfa Romeo's heritage stretches right back to 1910 when it was founded, and it has a continuous line of exceptional cars, particularly sports cars, so spiders and coupes, a continuous line of fantastically innovatory technology and beautiful design right from the off and all the way through to today.
Alfa Romeo is an interesting company, particularly in its early years, because it was an engineering company led first, so they had a great reputation for racing. And the design work at that time was really supplying chassis and then bodying them. So there was a coach-built body put on an existing chassis, and artists were used to create the images that would be sold to customers. So a customer would come in, an artist would draw an impression of the car, and then that car body would be created and put on the chassis. So it's quite an interesting process in the sense that there was real art in that, and the art sold the idea to the customer.
When Alfa was born in 1910, Alfa was just producing the rolling chassis, the mechanical parts. But step by step, the role, the communication role of the bodyworks start to grow up. And so Alfa start to cooperate with the most important Italian and not Italian coach builders, such as Zagato, Touring, Castagna, Farina. And there was a very strong and important competition between the designers in terms of shapes, but also in terms of technologies. And the result were cars able to win the most important concours d'élégance and to become icons of an entire age.
Alfa Romeo referred to its aesthetic sense in the early days and right up until today as essential beauty. So creating a line that was a great sense of proportion, aesthetically pleasing to the eye. It's hard to put a pin on exactly what makes a car great. I mean, if we could do that, we'd all be millionaires, but something in the heart of Alfa Romeo brings out this fantastic aesthetic sense.
Alfa Romeo cars were able to win the most important concours d'élégance in the 20s, in the 30s, but the same cars were able to win the most important races, such as the Mille Miglia, that an 8C 2900B won in 1947, 10 years after its production. But that period ended with Villa d'Este. The Villa d'Este was manufactured in 1949 and the same year won the Concours d'Elegance of Villa d'Este. And it represents the last evolution of handcrafted bodyworks. After the Villa d'Este, we have the presentation of the 1900, the 1900, manufactured on the assembly line with a monocoque body and opening a new generation of Alfa Romeo.
After the war, the real thing then was about turning designs into mass production. So there was a change in how companies were designing. But the advantage that Alfa had was that it used a lot of craftspeople in the Turin area, and they were able to bring metalwork craft to create real prototypes in metal rather than creating clay models or other processes that other companies were using. So in many ways, it transferred its low-volume coach-built processes to mass production.
I think the fact that design emerged in Italy at the time it did was partly to do with the fact that Italy industrialised very late. I mean, they were a craft-based society and culture right up to the 40s, really. So they industrialised just at the moment when that post-war reconstruction happens. So there's sort of economic growth, industrial growth all happening together, and design emerges out of that, really. The fact that Italy was so strong in its craft traditions is absolutely key to the way design emerged. They built on it, and it meant that they had the skills to manufacture, to make, and they added to that the ability to mass produce, which they learnt from America. Huge influence coming in from the US in the post-war years, but their craft base underpinned that.
With the 1900, we have an in-house design, we have an internal coach building department, but we also have the first industrial car with a very close relationship between the shape, the frame and the bodywork. It's a unibody construction. While the sedan version was in-house, the coupe version, such as the Sprint and Super Sprint, were still designed and manufactured by external coach builders, such as Touring. But the real revolution was the Giulietta, presented in 1954, because with the Giulietta, Alfa Romeo became a big industry, and the role of a design center became crucial.
Well, the 54 Giulietta was a game changer both for its maker and for the car market and of course for the car buyer. But after the war, when Italy and much of Europe had been ravaged by bombing and people had very little money, it was immediately obvious to the managers at Alfa Romeo that they couldn't continue to make the same kind of cars they'd made before the war. They had to make something more affordable, and the first car they made was a 1.9 litre saloon, which was a lot more modest than what they'd made before, but actually still quite a big and expensive car for the mainstream market. And they knew they'd have to do something more affordable than that, and that was the Giulietta, which in many ways was a miniaturization of that 1900. And what set the tone for that car was really an accident of history, in that Alfa didn't really have the funds to pay for the Giulietta development program, so they hit upon the radical idea of having a national lottery, and the prize winners, of which there were quite a few, would win a Giulietta. And the result was they actually did get quite the money together they needed, but their problem was that they were running late with the program for the saloon, and the newspapers had got wind of this and stories started to appear, and obviously the makings of a scandal. So to satisfy the winners, they fast-tracked the development of the development mule, which was a little coupe, and they restyled it a bit and got Bertoni, the coach builders, to put it into production.
Per presentare alla stampa e ai tecnici la nuova creatura uscita dalle sue officine, la Giulietta Sprint, la vettura che per le sue pregevoli
It's great to revisit this 50s Alfa Romeo Giulietta Sprint. It's meant so much to Italy when this car appeared. 1954, they had gone through post-war depression and the industry was just going to the 50s. Finally, they could get going and start dreaming of adventures again. And Alfa Romeo were right there with this car. Alfa Romeo were a much-loved brand in Italy. You can't imagine the love for the brand from it racing. It almost raced for Italy rather than just Alfa Romeo. And they used to do much bigger cars, coach-built cars, but this was the first real mass-produced car, and it looked great. It was an instant hit, which you can tell from the outside, just the styling, the immense speed, and it was accessible at a price that you could just about afford. And the specification of the car was pretty special too. Twin cam engine. They only used to be in race cars, and here it was in an Alfa Romeo for the people. 1300cc in this example, 65 horsepower. Doesn't sound much, but it's plenty. It's over 100 miles an hour. I like the way it was all about speed and adventure of this car. In front of me, the dials, dead ahead, the rev counter, 6,000 RPM, red line. I've got oil temperature, I've got water temperature, I've got 180 kilometre an hour speedo. They're all to be hit, all those numbers. I also like in the centre of the wheel, you think you've got a horn push, I've got a horn push there, but right in the middle, it flashes the headlights. Just get out of my way, I'm in my Alfa Romeo Giulietta Sprint. Don't you realise you need to make way because I'm in speed? And I just love that about Alfa Romeo. It's all about the driving. You also notice I've got no seatbelts on. Well, that wasn't a thing in the 50s at all. But the Italians were very late adopters to seatbelts, because there was I remember an interview with a professor of sociology in Italy, and he said the Italians didn't like wearing seatbelts because that was almost an admission that you were a bad driver, you're about to have a crash. So they didn't bother with seatbelts for a long time. This car is all about revs, so I'm going to change down. Just taste that extra speed. I've got to rev it, I've got to go flat out. It's how you drive an Italian car, and you probably can't hear me now. that didn't matter to the owner of this car. It was just the style and everything it meant to be Italian Alfa Romeo. To see that in your garage must have been a mighty proud moment. So lovely to revisit this car again. It meant so much to Italy. This is 65 years old, this car. It doesn't feel it down here. It still has that verve that it had on day one when it first appeared in 1954, and I'm still feeling that through the wheel now. So great to revisit.
So Dale, it is such a joy to be here with this 1954 Giulietta Sprint Bertone. And I really want to pick your brains from all your expertise of teaching vehicle design at the Royal College of Art and being a vehicle designer yourself to understand why this car is such a masterpiece.
Well, it is a spectacular car, I agree, and I think there's a lot of things about this car that really are very important in terms of when it was done, but also its continued influence even today. You can see it's got every detail, and the way the car has been constructed from a design point of view is to make the car look like it's moving fast through the air all the time, and all the details and everything conspire to give you that impression.
I mean, you can just see this car on the street in Italy with this popping colour really turning heads in the mid-50s.
Oh, it must have been spectacular when it came out. I mean, I think the concept of a coupe was quite radical at that time. We had saloon cars and we had, first of the sports cars, open cars, but the coupe was quite a new revolution in terms of proportion, and so designers were beginning to experiment with this type of form language for these vehicles.
And this car, it's almost like one seamless object, isn't it? I mean, I can look at it almost like a piece of clothing or something. There's very few seams on it. It's literally like the new look, a sculptural object on wheels. But I imagine to do that in metal is an incredible feat of engineering and design.
Absolutely, and I think it's a very good point. I mean, when you look at this car, there's a few shut lines, but they're sparingly put on the car, door entries around the bonnet entry, but there's no panel shuts. It's all been made out of many pieces of material put together and then beautifully smoothed to create this overall form. You wouldn't have seen this sort of thing on a lot of European cars or British cars at the time. You would have seen panels joining each other, maybe with a piece of chrome trim to cover a joint or a piece of rubber to cover a joint. So this was really a clean piece of design.
Italian car manufacturers and designers were hugely influenced by America. And one has to remember that a lot of their tooling, a lot of their equipment in the factories was American derived. Things like the metal presses, those sorts of heavy machinery were funded by the States. But they developed a very different aesthetic. They used the streamlining, but they didn't add all the kind of extra, what we call things like speed whiskers, the little details that Americans put on cars to make them look flashy and Detroit style. They left that off. And what they were really doing was emulating organic sculpture. So although the body shells had a lot in common, they didn't push it that far and decorate it. They left it very minimal.
Because if you follow it around, literally every view, it's like a 360-degree masterpiece, isn't it?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's not a bad side on this car. Some designs you look at, and you go around the car and it falls apart at a certain point. The lines fall apart or the details fall apart. But on this, it's so refined, and considering it went through a very rapid design process, you can see that someone has been really controlling the whole thing. I think when you look at any piece of design, part of the success is the individual components. How good are the individual components? If you take off the door handle or anything else, how does it look as a piece of design in its own right? And if you look at something like this window frame here, first of all, the shape of the glass is just beautifully done with a lot of care to get this acceleration in terms of turning the direction. So it's not just a simple straight line curve, it's accelerating. Designers call this snap, where the line accelerates quickly, and you get this feeling of tension and movement in
You can almost see the drawing, can't you?
Yeah, you can see it's like an arc. It's like someone's hand movement. It's not a mechanical movement. It's much more fluid, and it's accentuated by this beautifully delicate piece of metalwork that runs around the car. And again, you look at cars that were coming out of the UK at this time, British cars. They tended to be very clunky. Often the metalwork was there to cover a bad seam or a welding joint.
Often the doors leaked, didn't they?
Yeah, exactly. So you'd have a kind of, if you had a bad joint, you'd put a piece of chrome over it to make it work. And you see this on cars, Even this drip train is beautifully done. And
but you're saying everything about this car is for function and elegance. Nothing is unnecessary or...
No, and it reflects the kind of the craft techniques, but also the manufacturing of it, because if you look at this front pillar, it's so thin in comparison to what you would get in Europe, or you look at compared to modern cars, how thin this is, and that's because there was great technique of being able to put material together.
To actually craft this in metal, to get convex and concave curves in metal and some sharp edges.
Yes.
I mean, that is so skilled. How do they actually do that?
Well, this car came out of a period where it was a special car, and it was built by Bertoni, a design company. And at that time, they had very different techniques being used in Italy compared to what was being used around the world. In America and the UK, most cars were being designed through sketching and clay modelling, but this would have been designed using drafting drawings and then making wooden books and manipulating the metal over a wooden former. So it means that you have to be very controlled how you do it. And of course, in Turin, where this car came from, there was a fantastic history of metalwork because it had been a centre of making suits of armour and things like that for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there was a massive amount of craft skill. And it's really interesting to see how, in Italy particularly, this could only come from Italy because that marriage of design and craft coming together was so unique.
But the thing I love that you've taught me is that it actually comes from almost medieval traditions of metal bashing, and obviously the history of art in Italy being the ultimate. So it all sort of comes together in this new age object, which is a car.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think that's really fascinating. Italy had this tremendous culture of art and design. You can see it in the cathedral art and all the rest of it you see in Italy. And so this was really about craftspeople coming into the design world as a mass-produced object, which I think is a fascinating story.
The Giulietta changed the shape of the car market somewhat, in that you can argue that it was one of the first premium post-war cars. It started off the idea that you can have a small, sophisticated, small but not cheap package that was a car that was very sporty to drive and a cut above your average mainstream family car. And that's a template that Alfa has essentially followed ever since, but it's been much copied since, particularly and most successfully, ironically, by the German makers Audi, BMW and Mercedes, who've taken that idea and, if you like, well, BMW particularly with the 3 Series, which is a sort of modern Alfa Giulietta or Alfa Giulia in a way. It's a sporting, compact saloon. Other makers were around for a while, so Triumph in Britain pursued that idea a bit with the Dolomite and Dolomite Sprint. But Alfa were absolutely one of the pioneers of that concept.
celebration of automotive design and the idea of annual model change for cars and the use of concept cars to sell dreams has to be traced back to the first in-house automotive design studio. That was established by Harley-Earl in 1927 at General Motors, and Harley-Earl was this big Hollywood figure who created loads of customized cars for the Hollywood stars, and then was recruited by Alfred Sloan to create an in-house studio. That studio not only changed the course of the automotive industry and its use of design, but actually changed the story for all products, because the idea of annual model change and ultimately built-in obsolescence in products comes from that studio. Perhaps the most interesting example of Alfa's use of concept cars is the Alfa Bat triptych of concept cars that were launched in 1953 at the Turin Motor Show. Here, Franco Scaglione takes a very standard Alfa 1900 chassis that was mass-produced in the post-war period, and he transforms it, metamorphosizes it into what becomes known as the Bat cars. Now, many people think the Bat cars are so called because they have these amazing wings that come out of the back of the cars, beautiful sculptural forms, but actually the reason is because they were aerodynamic studies. So they are the perfect fusion of maths and science and art. The more research I do into the origins of concept car, it keeps on coming back to this most successful, most extraordinary example created by Studio Bertoni due to their relationship with Alfa and the ability to create this perfect embodiment of art, craft and technology as to my mind, as a work of art on wheels.
To do a concept, to design it, to think a concept is very important, because you do a step in the future. You go in the future. You have to put in relation a lot of discipline, not only engineering, technique, design, but also marketing, communication, and so on. Depends what you want to communicate, because design is not only design. Design is also to communicate what you want to do, and what is a brand identity and product identity together.
I think the concept car has two main functions. Firstly, there's at the brand level. It's a way of gathering headlines. It's a way of putting some gloss on the brand, a halo if you like, and showing that the brand is active, that it's forward-looking, it's got ideas, it's fresh, it has that vitality to it, if you will. But secondly, it's very important in terms of showcasing where the company is going, and from a design perspective, it's a great opportunity to test the water for what the company is thinking. Often concept cars are actually done after a forthcoming product. They can quite often take that product that is coming, but remember, in the motor industry we have very long lead times, and then put some more elements on it that are more futuristic, that they want to gain public opinion of, and then put that out there as a concept car. And it's a way of not only testing the waters, but if you like, sort of softening the market up, ready for what might be a significant change of direction. So they really are a vital part of the puzzle when it comes to a new car.
I concept car sono importantissimi perché si cerca sempre delle architetture, delle suggestioni che possono attrarre o possono dare uno spunto importante per lo sviluppo delle vetture di serie. Quindi la ricerca si esprime con questi concept che spesso sono vicini anche alla realtà in quanto sono viaggianti, altri ovviamente sono solo delle idee molto avanzate, ma comunque importanti per utilizzarle nei progetti che devono essere fatti per le vetture di serie. Comunque fanno sognare, dà una speranza di vedere qualcosa di eccezionale, comunque sono importanti sempre, anche se a volte andiamo nella fantascienza.
Yeah, the concept car can have many different roles, but I also think they still remain a great kind of litmus test, if you like, because when there is a successful concept car, I think everybody knows it. You know, there's a buzz around it. The journalists talk about it. It gets fed back to management. Everyone's excited. It's like anything, I suppose. It's that hard to define X factor, but a successful concept tends to lead to many other things, and that can sometimes be hard to predict. I think we all know it when we see it.
Ma l'Alfa Romeo Iguana è una ricerca di una vettura che aveva il motore posteriore, una vettura sportiva, quindi cercavamo qualcosa che fosse al di là della consuetudine di queste forme arrotondate, molto vicina a quelle che sono le esigenze per correre, per poter dare delle prestazioni. Allora si cerca delle forme, delle linee, delle architetture che siano attraenti al di là della loro eccessiva forma aerodinamica, sportiva, eccetera. Quindi una via di mezzo di quello che può essere una vettura di prestazioni. Quindi deve piacere, deve attrarre, e quindi l'ispirazione va sempre un po' con una certa libertà di ricerca.
First of all, I designed the Nuvola with Filippo Perini. Filippo Perini, you know, was in charge in Lamborghini, was in Audi with me, and after I moved him in Lamborghini. And I designed with him Aventador and Huracan. And with Filippo, I remember very well, and Carlo Giavazzi, that was my second hand in the Alfa Romeo Centro Stile. First, we designed. We need a compact size, not the design. We need a car because we remember the Alfa Romeo SZ, the round car. No, the idea is to do a compact coupe because Alfa Romeo is done. All the Alfa Romeo Spider coupe was very compact, very small, not a big engine, very small. This was the first challenge, to do a compact coupe. The second, to improve the front, the tritico, the scudetto, and the two moustache, no, before the launch of the 156. And last and not least, to create again in the Alfa Romeo lovers a feeling that Alfa Romeo is coming back, no? And it's a nice story because I've done the show car in secret, without a budget. The budget was from the innovation of Fiat. I take from innovation of Fiat with the help of a friend of mine, Engineer Merlini. And we built in secret, and we showed to my boss, Stefano Jacoponi, the model finish. Come on, I said, don't worry, we don't spend money in addition. And also we showed to the CEO, the Nuvola, but we launched in Paris, in the Paris Motor Show, without any support of communication. It was a success. You can imagine how many orders arrived before to do the car, but the car was stopped.
For me, a good example of a really exciting concept in recent years was the Brera concept, which showed that Alfa Romeo styling language, when applied in a modern sense, could still look really gorgeous. You know, the idea of a really beautiful coupe could still be realised. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one, you know, that was very excited about the prospect of such a car reaching production.
Ma il prototipo Breva, che è una ricerca di utilizzare un prodotto sportivo ma che avesse qualche contenuto di innovazione, una ricerca che è anche indirizzata su un'architettura elegante, non solo prettamente sportiva per andare a correre, quindi una via di mezzo di quelle che sono un po' le prerogative di un brand così importante come l'Alfa Romeo. Poi questi fari in queste feritoie che contengono questi gruppi ottici con questo scudetto che è la parte più importante che caratterizza questo brand. Alcuni elementi arrivano da osservazione di tutta quella che è la creatività dei vari progettisti nell'arco di molti anni, quindi si cerca di raccogliere quell'essenza, quel qualcosa che ti fa capire che questa è una vettura sportiva.
If someone says Alfa Spider to you, I would suggest this is the one you think of, the Alfa Romeo Duetto. 1966 this car came out, and it was based on a concept that first appeared in 1961. It was an aerodynamic concept done by Pininfarina. It didn't have headlights on it, but it just showed you this shape, this classic shape, teardrop shape, with this sort of scallop down the side. And you can just tell Alfa Romeo were looking for an excuse to use it. And finally, they launched this new Alfa Romeo Spider, the Duetto. Here it is, that concept come to life and into production. So it first appeared at Geneva 1966, and from then on it was a star. And you can see why this design is so classically Alfa. I love the use of the grille. They're so good at it in Alfa, and I know when I'm standing by this car how it's swept underneath. It's not showy, it's just a classic, beautifully done design. You've got these chrome overriders. They're meant to be bumpers, but I don't think they are at all. They don't hardly protect the bodywork as it sweeps round. I love how they put the number plate at the side as though it's dismissive. You don't really need to run a number plate. The flared in headlights, we only used to see that on race cars, but here it is on this little Alfa Spider. Come round the side and you see this cuttlefish design, this very distinctive scallop out the side here. And if you look at it, it's actually quite a lot bigger than the previous Spider before. It's about a foot longer. And that was all to do with that aerodynamic concept that they had. They thought the longer, the more teardrop they get to the rear, the slipperier the car was. And this car, 1600cc, 118 miles an hour when it came out. That's pretty good in 1966. But that was all to do with the shape and its aerodynamics, how it cut through the air. Quite an extended tail, as I say. Also, round the back, I just like the simplicity. At no point does it say 1600 or Spider, it just says Alfa Romeo. And then if you look down, the exhaust pipe, even that has been designed. It comes out at an angle, it's chrome, it has this twin cam engine. They wanted to make sure you knew that if you'd just been overtaken by this car. And then other details on it, the little tiny quarter-light chrome bumpers. They don't want to dominate. It's a lightweight car, so that's why it's got the quarter bumpers on it. Simple steel wheels on this. You could get aluminium wheels as an option, but it has stood the test of time. And again, a Pininfarina badge is on the side here as well as on the dash. And what you've got to remember about in this day, Pininfarina weren't just a design house, they were a manufacturing house. They actually built this car, the body, and then did the final assembly at their own factory. This wasn't actually built at an Alfa plant. All those things that appeal to those in the 60s with this car just continued on forever. And this car had the longest life of any other Alfa Romeo. And it was strange because it just evolved. Every other model had to be replaced, but not so with the Alfa Spider. And to go to 1992, it was just because it appeals to that heart, and it's the same appeal it had in the 60s it had in the 90s. And that's why it lived on for so long, this car. Such a great design.
as has often happened with the motor industry, governments have sometimes tried to use their industrial might to socially engineer, if you like, or help unemployment basically by getting a new car plant to be built in an area of high unemployment, which in principle is a great idea. Happened in Britain and in other countries. In Italy, the idea was to build a plant in Naples in the south, and so this plant was built. In fact, it wasn't just a plant, it was a whole project around a new, much more affordable Alfa, called the Alfa Sud for south. A car really that competed with much more with Fiats and Fords and Renaults and so on. Designed by Giugiaro and Ital Design, not just the styling, but the entire vehicle, the mechanical layout, everything. You know, an amazing project, which produced a car that was fantastic to drive. It won endless comparison tests. And not only that, but it was a very practical car, very spacious. It was easy to maintain, cheap to maintain, built in a brand new factory. So everything's set for success, but the whole work ethic in Naples wasn't really built around the discipline of car factories. On top of that, Italy was importing very poor quality steel at the time, and so Italian cars, not just Alfas but Fiats and Lancias, the Italian cars of the 70s rusted so fast, and the combination of poor quality, poor rust proofing and low grade metal meant that the Alfa Sud project, which should have been a fantastic success, struggled. It wasn't a total failure. But it could have done even better, and it could have made money. Having revived its styling reputation to good effect with the 164 saloon, Alfa then set about surprising everybody with a limited edition car, which, to be honest, utterly amazed people.
Roll back to 1986. Alfa Romeo was in financial trouble. Basically, the Italian government asked Fiat to buy the company, which it did. And the guy in charge, a chap called Vittorio Guidella, said, "I want a new statement sports car for Alfa Romeo," and asked the design department to come up with 2 different proposals. And 2 teams competed with each other to come up with a real defining moment for the sports car. And at that time, sports cars were kind of a bit passé. MG, Triumph were dead and gone. You only really had companies like Porsche and Lotus in the sports car arena. So this was a real opportunity for Alfa Romeo to come in and make a real statement. And the SZ project really is that statement. So the name of this car is SZ, and the Z stands for Zagato. However, it didn't design this car, it only built it. The car was actually designed in-house at Alfa Romeo as part of a competition between 2 different teams within the department. The design that was eventually chosen was from a sketch that was really out there, really wild. They decided they were going to go for it because this was the statement they'd been looking for. And they translated that sketch into the real car using computer-aided design, the very, very first example of that ever in the history of car design. So the car broke cover at the 1989 Geneva Motor Show. and it was widely reported in the press at the time. That's where I got my first sight of the car. It caused a lot of controversy at the time because it's just such an out there design. Some people thought it was absolutely hideous. In fact, most people thought it was absolutely hideous. Other people thought it was the most incredibly bold piece of design they'd ever seen. One of the great appeals of this car is its engine, the V6 Busso, named after the designer Giuseppe Busso. It's got power, it's got torque, and when you press the accelerator, it's got this amazing sound. Here we go. The 6 headlamp front on this car was specifically picked up by Klaus Busser, head of Alfa Romeo's design, when he was doing the front end for the Tonale SUV. He really wanted to show a link between this car, which is so bold, and the Tonale. It's a little bit of a slow burn for me, I must say, because, yeah, it was ugly. But being so bold, it hasn't really aged in the same way that cars that kind of follow a particular form do. It's still as fresh and outlandish today as it was in 1989.
After the shock of the SZ, we had the rather more ordinary 155 saloon, which wasn't that exciting as even Alfa saloons go. But what it was replaced with was something altogether different. This was the first significant car that Walter de Silva produced, and a car that really put his name on the map.
My dream was to work for Alfa Romeo. In 50 or 60 years, to have an Alfa Romeo in Italy was to have a dream car. And I was this capability to drawing, and I started to design car all my life. And one day, an engineer that was Rudolf Ruska called me. I was in Idea Institute before, I was working for Fiat, and they said to me, they want you in Alfa Romeo to come like a chief designer for Alfa. And the dream was the reality. And if you dream a lot in your life, you can have a result, an important result. This was my dream. The 156 success comes from two reasons. First reason, the commitment. Mr. Cantarella come to me and say, if the 156 is not a success, we have to close Alfa Romeo. This was the briefing. The second briefing, I was in competition with Giorgetto, Giugiaro. So the motivation was the goal. And one day, working in the workshop in Centro Stile Alfa Romeo, I was looking my Giulietta Spider, and I've seen this Scudetto through the front, vertical. I was in the model shop and say, come on, do a Scudetto like that. Yeah, but what we do with the number plate? Forget the number plate, I'm not interested. Do this. In the final presentation, I put one handle in the front door. And after the second handle, I arrived with the second handle in the end. Because the greenhouse of the car is so compact that it looks a coupe. And this coupe feeling I would like to maintain. If you put a double handle, you immediately see that there are two doors. And I have to say, it was the CEO of the company, Mr. Cantarella, say, no, Walter, I agree with you. Keep out the second handle and put in the window. And the technical was a little, but in the end, this was the decision, and this was one of the nice details of this car. But Alfa Romeo 156 is also the clean side, is also the right proportion, the coda tronca in the heck, the slim rear lights, there are a lot of it. And also, less is more. You have a lot information, but in a very athletic body style. This period was a dream. I remember when we was working in the motor show, like Ginevra Motor Show, we received a lot of congratulations because our models, our car, Alfa was back. Only Fiat don't understand this.
When I entered in Fiat and I took also the responsibility of the Alfa Romeo Styling Center, the first project on which I had to put the hands was a C-segment hatchback that later was introduced into the market as the Giulietta. The generation of the 159, Brera and Spider that were designed by Giugiaro was a fantastic effort because they were coming from a concept car that was made on a completely different platform and had proportion and the stance that were absolutely different. But Giugiaro managed to come out with more conventional cars to be sold in numbers that didn't lose at all the appeal of the concept car. So it was able to come out with a very, very convincing design that I always loved. The cars apparently had other problems, like they were too heavy and some of the engine were not at the level you could expect from Alfa Romeo. They were very thirsty, they had a lot of consumption. And I think that at the moment when Marchionne found out that the numbers of the company allowed him to foresee a big investment on the Alfa Romeo brand, he decided to do a bold step and to invest a huge amount of money into the development of the Alfa Romeo brand.
So we've got all these beautiful cars being made, much better than the stuff coming out in the 80s. And late 70s, but it's not of the caliber of the German brands until we get to this extraordinary moment, which I've never come across before in the car industry, where the Fiat Chrysler, the owners of Alfa Romeo, stand up in front of their investors and say, we have not managed Alfa Romeo well. There is a presentation which you can download to this day, now 6 years old, that explains how they delivered on style, but these other 4 characteristics that they believe you need, most of them relating to engineering aspects and the driving pleasure, they failed to deliver on. I really admired them for owning up to that. It takes some nerve to do that. And of course, you wouldn't do it if you weren't then going to say, this is how we're going to fix it. And so they embarked on an expensive, ambitious program to completely renew the Alfa Romeo range, this time with its own dedicated platform and dedicated engines. They set up a skunk works, as it's called, which is a sort of off-site, semi-secret engineering facility. It was led by Ferrari engineers to develop the new Giulia and the Stelvio, and then a variety of other vehicles from it. A total no-compromise platform of the kind that you would expect BMW or Mercedes to develop, so just what's required.
And so we had the chance of starting from scratch with the white sheet of paper, and to design a car on the perfect proportion. I mean, a long hood, a quite compact cabin, a very muscular car. That's something that we didn't have the chance to do before, and that was why we didn't get to something acceptable before. When the project started, Sergio Marchionne asked me to oversee the project. And of course, the director of design at Alfa Romeo was Marco Tencone. We had very similar views in terms of design, in terms of Italian design, and how to respect and relaunch Italian design on the new generation of cars. I had already the experience of relaunching a brand, because I was there when the Maserati brand was relaunched in the early 2000s. In Pininfarina we have designed the Maserati Quattro Porte and the Maserati Gran Turismo. And so I had already an experience of trying to recapture the spirit of the brand, starting from scratch after a number of years without major projects. I tried to focus on the heritage of Italian design. In the case of the Giulia, for instance, we had a completely new platform, and in some way we could discuss with the engineers that were developing the underpinnings together with us, that we were developing the body, the skin, to bypass some problems that we could have in design. So it was more a joint effort. It was not something that was already there, but it was something that we could really develop together. And it was quite unique.
There is so much to talk about with the Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio, but I think one of the key things is that, quite frankly, it was a surprise. And that's because Alfa Romeos over the preceding 20 years were usually fabulous to look at. But it has to be said, and yes, I know this is going to upset a few people, they didn't always drive as well as they looked. So when news of this car came out, there was many a cynical person. And I have to say, even when stories of a crack engineering team behind it leaked out and Ferrari engineers being seconded over to the project, still people thought, yeah, but it's never gonna hold a candle to a BMW M3. And even when we learnt that it would have a 510 horsepower twin-turbo V6 driving the rear wheels, it still seemed hard to believe that it would do the business, that it could usurp cars like the BMW M3. Well, it arrived and it did. So much so that it even became Evo's Sports Saloon of the Year. So what makes this car so good? Well, it's a fantastic blend of performance and handling, ride comfort, refinement, all wrapped up in a really, really desirable package with that famous Italian styling. But I think there's something more to its appeal, and that's that it's something unique. It has a particularly sweet blend of ride and handling that you just can't find anywhere else. And I think for that reason, it has its own character. That character, I think we can say, is the new Alfa Romeo. So we're in the Stelvio Quadrifoglio now, the twin brother of the Giulia, and we've got the same 510 horsepower V6 under the bonnet, which in a car like this, in a fairly compact SUV, is a lot of power. Now make that a hilarious amount of power. This is a very quick car. But if we're looking for what an Alfa Romeo is, we have to ask ourselves, is that really something you can find in an SUV? I mean, there are compromises, obviously. This doesn't drive in such a dynamic way as the Giulia. It can't do. It weighs more and the centre of gravity is higher. However, there is something about the way the Stelvio Quadrifoglio drives that does make it a sporting choice amongst the other high-performance SUVs that are there. It's a dynamism, it's a response to the steering. It goads you into driving it faster. And that, I think, is something that you can draw right the way through Alfa's history. Anyway, that's enough of the serious stuff. I reckon this is one of the best roads in England, so I'm going to knock that into manual and enjoy my 510 horsepower, if you don't mind.
Back in 2020, we had with Alfa Romeo the 110th anniversary of the brand. Thinking about this anniversary, we wanted something very special to celebrate this, so we thought about, of course, introducing a special gift, a special product on the market. So we developed, based on the Giulia, we developed the GTA and the GTA Aim, and this is clearly the celebration of this anniversary. And it's also the best know-how of the brand in terms of design and sportiveness. It creates really the links between the current range that we have with the Giulia and also the fantastic history of the brand. So more than anything else, this is a gift. This product is a gift for our passionate Alfisti and all the collectors that we have for the brand.
There's never a moment where we work in isolation here in Centro Stile. An Alfa Romeo, because yes, we're very proud about how beautiful Alfa Romeos are, but equally how well they perform. So to achieve this balance between beauty and performance, it can only work if from the beginning we have an equal participation between design and engineering. And of course, especially when you work on a machine like the GTA or the GTA-M, which is all about performance. Yes, the car looks incredible, and I think the solutions are really nicely translated into something that is also aesthetically in line with the car, but very much in collaboration with engineering. So it was a true partnership of the two functions at all times.
With the Giulia, we try to find a way to express an Italian way to design that is more emotional and less rational than the one of other competitors in the segment. So we wanted a shape that invites you to cheer it, to pass your hand on the surface, that doesn't scare you with angles, with broken surfaces, with character line. It's something unitary, is a kind of a living sculpture, and something that appeals to your emotional side more than to your rational side. That's what we wanted to achieve.
You might wonder whether heritage and cars that have gone in the past matters so much now that we've got Tesla and other startup car companies who are making purely electric vehicles, and in Tesla's case, a great success of it. Does all this heritage and history matter? I can't say I know the answer to that, but I would say, slightly regretfully, that it might matter a bit less than it used to, because this is a new world we're in now. Having said that, I think the things that Alfa Romeo stands for and represents are still utterly relevant today, because who doesn't like a beautiful car? Of course you'd want a beautiful car. It's just that it's got to deliver in other areas. Who doesn't want a car that performs? Electric vehicles are all about performance. It's staggering how well they perform. So an electric Alfa Romeo can surely be a real Alfa Romeo. And these things will be raced. Alfa Romeo has the most fantastic racing heritage. There's no reason why that can't continue. This is a brand that can be made relevant, if you like, to today. But it's not enough to have heritage on its own. You've got to keep delivering it. Otherwise, your heritage simply freezes in the past. You don't really have it anymore. You've just got to keep layering it on.
So the question is always what's next, and we're very excited about the product we have currently in the market with the Giulia and the Stelvio. But at the same time, we already have mentioned the Tonale, and the Tonale again is another departure for us from a design point of view. We are embracing wonderful details like the 3+3 headlights, but at the same time, the underlying fundamental belief that it's all about sculpture, that it's all about restraint, not over-decorating our cars, but focusing on very few iconic elements. The aforementioned 3+3 headlights, our iconic Scudetto, the Fondi wheels. Even if you observe in the rear window the kick of the 147 or the first generation Alfa 8C. So those are all echoes of the past, but put together in a beautiful new package, in a beautiful new design. And we want to create attention, but we want to do it with the right iconic details and avoid distraction with wrong and decorative details.
The Tonale has been presented back in 2019 as a concept. The rationale behind this concept is to prepare the launch of our future C SUV. So we have today the Stelvio as the big SUV. We are going to have the second phase of our SUV range, which will be the Tonale, which will play in the biggest segments all over Europe and all over across the globe. We aim with this Tonale really to make another step in terms of volume for the brand, so it's really an important step for the development of Alfa Romeo. It will come, of course, with the traditional, I would say, petrol and diesel engines, but also the Tonale will mark the start of the brand entering into the electrification mode, because the Tonale will start also with the plug-in hybrid, which will be the first of the future products electrified with Alfa Romeo.
So when we speak about electrification, there's two aspects in context with Alfa Romeo that I'm very excited about. On the one hand, electrification has a very strong performance aspect. and I think that's very fitting to the brand. But also from a design point of view, it offers opportunities for us because we do not have to design around a big engine, we do not have to design around a big transmission tunnel. So there's more space to try certain things, to even give space back to the driver and the passengers of the car. So overall, it's something we're extremely positive about. Obviously, I'm here representing a team. Cars do not get designed by one person. Cars are teamwork. A teamwork of designers, sculptors, modelers, but also engineers, product planners, the people from brand. And only together, in close collaboration, we can create amazing product.
The Alfa Romeo, when you think about it, some of the people are thinking about the performance. For me, it's more the other side of the brand, which is the design, the beauty. We have been able with these cars to really always, when we put a new product on the market, to always draw it like if it was so easy to put this on the paper. So, but there is the expression of the beauty of the design, of pure design, pure Italian one. So this is for me what makes me love Alfa Romeo, and for sure this combination between this and the sportiveness makes this unique.
I think all of us in this industry, deep down, want to see a healthy, vibrant, forward-looking Alfa Romeo. I really believe that because Alfa Romeo's history is of making beautiful, fun to drive, great cars. What we want to see, I think, is a brand that inevitably has to embrace that new technology, new powertrains and so forth, but that keeps that Alfa Romeo spirit. Trying to define that spirit, of course, is not the easiest of things, but it is something which I think if you speak to someone else that has that enthusiasm for cars, they intrinsically know what you mean when you talk about the Alfa Romeo spirit. So, looking ahead, Alfa Romeo's challenge is to make these new kind of vehicles and have a viable business, but retain that indomitable spirit.